From the Pyle Media Venture Studio in Noblesville, Indiana, this is the Jacob Pyle Show, with tonight's guest, author Frederick Golder, and the host of our show, Jacob Pyle.
Thank you, Zach, very, very, very much. Well, hello everybody, and welcome to the Jacob Pyle Show. Hang on, there we go. My name is Jacob Pyle, and I'm glad to have you with us. For the next 30 minutes, unscripted conversations, but with a difference. No shouting, no cussing. All topics that we are discussing on the show have been approved by me before the show taping. Have you ever ran into a conflict that you needed help in resolving? Chances are you probably have met this man in the process of resolving your particular conflict. My guest for tonight is a professor, an attorney, and an expert in conflict and resolution. He also has written several books on the subject, including his most recent book, Reaching Common Ground, which is published by Luminaire Press and can be found on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and other places. Joining us now via Zoom is Professor Frederick T. Golder. Welcome, Fred, to the show. Do you go by Fred or Frederick?
You can call me Fred, Jacob. The main thing is really getting the information to your listening audience.
Now, for those who don't know you, go ahead and tell us about yourself first.
All right. Well, I've been teaching and practicing law for over 35 years. And I did a lot of civil rights trial work. I actually went in courtroom and tried cases for a living, which was a difficult proposition. And about, I want to say, maybe 20 years ago, I got this epiphany and I said, there's got to be a better way to resolve conflicts than lawsuits, trials. So I came to the realization that conflict resolution could be done through mediation, through other methods that didn't involve courts. So from that period on, I started teaching conflict resolution to students from many different universities. I taught at Harvard Law School mediation. I taught at Northeastern University, Emory Law School down in Atlanta, the Massachusetts School of Law in Andover, Suffolk University Law School. So I've been around talking about mediation and trying to help people resolve conflicts through these amazing methods. So here I am now. I've been teaching it for quite a while. And then 2015 comes along and I said, what's going on? What is this polarization all about? What is this? This is conflict that seems a little strange. So I started to do some research into the causes of conflict. I looked at biology. I know it sounds a little strange, but biology, genetics, evolution, personality, psychology, motivation, so many different aspects. And because I have one foot in academia, I had access to some of the most brilliant people who studied different aspects of conflict from their particular area of expertise. And they got to share some amazing insights with me. I took all of the information they provided to me. I connected the dots and I said, oh my God, I have to write this book. And all the information they provided me became my book, Reaching Common Ground. And in this book, I get to explain the reasons for all this conflict, what's behind the polarization, why sometimes we have people on one side or the other side of a political divide, and they can't talk to each other. And I found out from my research why. And then I wanted to explain the different types of conflicts that people have. And finally, in the last part of the book, I explained to them how to do it successfully. So that's really how I came to write the book.
Okay. Now tell us about your tell us about your book, Reaching Common Ground.
So it's divided into three parts. As I said, it starts with the causes of conflict, what causes conflict, and then it goes into the different types of conflict that we have. And finally, part 3 talks about how to do it, how to solve these conflicts. And I also have an appendix, which is really kind of fun. The appendix has a series of questionnaires so that you can really get into some really unusual kinds of things. For example, I have a section that deals with personality, what kind of personality you are. It makes a big difference. I know it sounds a little unusual, but there's actually a genetic component to people who lean left or lean right. Sometimes they call them reds, sometimes they call them blues, but the idea is there's a genetic component. I had one of my colleagues who teaches at New York University studied this for 20 years, and he came up with, believe it or not, genetic. And I said, how's that possible? And then I started realizing that in our personality, we have 5 major personality traits, which your audience, some of them might know, some might not, but I think it's important to understand.
Ask away.
That we have all these traits, and there are 5 major traits that all of us have: openness, conscientiousness, extravision, agreeableness, and finally neuroticism. So these are all of the things that we have in different degrees. So you'll notice that if someone is really open, they're more likely to lean to the left. If they're not as open, they're more likely to lean to the right. And it's part of our genetic makeup. They've studied this. This gentleman has studied it for years, and he can almost predict in terms of how our genetic composition works. And then I also got some amazing information and insight from Jonathan Haidt, who talks about moral foundations. And we have different moral foundations and this all comes from evolution. So I got evolution involved in all of this. But the best.
Okay.
All right. So let me give you some things that for your listening audience that I think will really help. So first of all, they've got to understand that we have genetic differences. We all do. Nobody is the same. Everybody has genetic differences. Now, we may have some similarities. I mean, we both have, generally speaking, most people have 2 arms and 2 legs, and they have all the things that most people have, but they're different in certain ways. We all grow up in different environments. So those are different, and they cause the polarization. So we've got genetic differences, nature. We've got the environmental differences, nurture. We have the personality differences. We have bias, prejudice, and stereotyping that impacts us. There's economic disparity, right? And power imbalances. And all of these things make up who we are and make up why we have these differences that create the problems. Now, when you get into all of it, you get to realize that a lot of the conflict, by the way, conflict is not necessarily bad. In fact, conflict is inevitable in any human situation. You're always going to have conflict. There's no way to get around it. We're going to have conflict. So the idea is not to avoid conflict. The idea is to recognize the conflict. And when you recognize the conflict and you recognize why there may be conflict, you're in a much better position to be able to deal with the conflict in a constructive way. So my book really focuses on why, and then it focuses on how to engage with people who have different ideas. And we have all these hidden biases that impact on how we see the world. And if you're mindful of these biases, it puts you in a much better situation to learn to listen, which is probably the most important thing you can do when you're dealing with someone whose opinions are different than yours. You listen, well, I like to call it a learning conversation. You learn to listen, and you learn in a way that lets you understand. So
Okay, I hate to interrupt you, but we have to take a break. When we come back, more with Frederick Golder. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Jacob Pyle Show. My guest for tonight is Frederick T. Golder, author of Reaching Common Ground, which is published by Luminary Press. It can be found on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and other places. Now, you were in the middle of a thought when we had to pause for that break. Go ahead and finish your thoughts.
Sure. So now we're dealing with biases that impact on how we communicate with each other. And I like to call it a learning conversation. So what's a learning conversation? It really is using active listening skills. So the idea is when someone has opinions that are different than yours, and remember, opinions are formed as a result of the cultural environment that you're brought up in. You really sometimes have no control over that. They keep telling you things, and pretty soon it becomes part of your opinion. And it's not necessarily based on facts, but it's based on your cultural environment. So you're not going to change anybody's opinion. So the best you can really hope for, instead of arguing, well, how can you think that? Well, how can you think that? Instead of getting into that conversation, you get into the conversation, that's very interesting. Why don't you explain a little bit more? Because I'm never going to change your opinion. You can change your opinion if you want to change it, but no one else is going to make me change my opinion because it's based upon my life experiences. And when you challenge someone, it gets really heated. So the way to avoid it is to use your active listening skills. You ask them open-ended questions. You ask for clarification. You're attentive. You do all these things because your goal is not to change the person's opinion. Your goal is to understand, not to judge as being right or wrong or better or worse. But when your goal is to learn and not judge, you're going to have a much more civil conversation, and you're in a much better position to whatever the conflict is to find a solution to it using your active listening skills. That's really an important piece in trying to communicate with other people who may have different opinions. Now, this is really interesting because this comes from my colleague, Jonathan Haidt, professor, brilliant man, and he talks about, in terms of the differences between the blues and the reds, or the lefts and the rights, that the people on the left generally rely on, for their moral foundation, care, fairness, liberty. That's mostly what they are concerned about. They want fairness, liberty, and care. But the reds, or those who lean to the right, in addition to care, fairness, and liberty, they also are important. Moral foundations for them is loyalty, authority, and sanctity. So right from the beginning, their foundations, what is important to each of those groups, are different. Not necessarily better or worse, different. And if you look at it that way, you're much apt to find a much better way of working together. That's pretty much it in a nutshell.
Okay, cool. All right, now I always tell people this. I always do my homework on my guests before we have them on, and I went to your website, which, for those of you who don't know, it's tell the folks what your website is. And on that site, if you go to the homepage, there is a list of certain conflict types that Fred deals with, and I compiled that list together, and I'm going to get your thoughts on each of these topics. Now, before I have to issue this one disclaimer. what you're about to hear is not intended and should not be used as legal advice at all. If you're dealing with a problem or something like that, go to a legal attorney or somebody like Fred.
Oh yeah, well, here's the thing. There are two. There's really, I mean, if you think about it, a legal conflict. If you have a legal conflict, you definitely want to go to a lawyer. If you have a conflict that doesn't involve a legal issue, then this is a very useful book. But don't rely on this if you've got a legal conflict. The legal conflict belongs in the hands of the lawyer. This is not the place you want to be.
Okay, so let's get started here with this list. Now, the first one is employment issues. Now, I will say this because we're in Indiana, because I had a similar situation happen to me. I've had jobs where, where your bosses could change your hours without your permission. They could let you go without permission and all that. And it took me a while to really, figure that out. But if it's legal or not. And it turns out in Indiana, it's legal. Now, go ahead. Now, what are your thoughts on that?
It has to be every state except Montana has what they call the doctrine of at will. And it comes from a British concept. But the bottom line is your employer can fire you for good reason, bad reason, no reason at all. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether you can be fired. However, there are some restrictions on that. For example, you can't be fired because of your religious beliefs, your race, your sex, your religion, all of those things. Those are protected by statute. So if there's a statute that protects your legal rights, by the way, I have another book called Uncivil Rights, and that explains to the layperson all the rights that you might have as an individual, so that you can look at the book and you say, oh yeah, I think they violated my rights to be free from discrimination because of my race, my sex, my religion, my national origin, my sexual orientation, or I can't be terminated for whistleblowing. So there's a lot of things that employers cannot do. They can fire you for no reason, but they can't fire you for an unlawful one, a discriminatory one. Those are things that they cannot do. They want to change your employment. They can do that anytime they want to do it. However, what the law says they can do or what the law says they cannot do doesn't change the fact that if you don't treat your employees decently, if you don't respect and value your employees, you're going to not last very long out there in the employment situation, because people like to be valued and respected. And if you're in an employment situation where you're not valued and respected, number one, you don't want to be there. And number two, that employer is not going to last long if they don't value the people, because that's what life is, my friend.
Amen. 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 I've been through many situations. I've been through many jobs where, the job I have now, the people, I work a full-time 40-hour night shift job, and it's like the people I work for there, like, they know my situation, they know my struggles, they respect me, they appreciate me. But I've been through jobs in my past too that, they don't care about their employees, they don't care about all this. All they care about is just making that money and getting the business going.
Well, I will tell you this, Jacob. There's a wonderful organization that I started along with a half a dozen colleagues back in the 1980s called the National Employment Lawyers Association. And the members of that organization are generally, I call civil rights workers. They're civil rights lawyers for workers. And they're all over the United States. And most of them are really dedicated to helping workers who have been discriminated against, who have been treated unfairly in the workplace, and help them through that maze of law that, having done this for so many years, I can tell you that if you have a medical problem, you don't want to be in a hospital. If you have a legal problem, you don't want to be in a courtroom. You're not going to get justice in the courtroom, generally speaking, and oftentimes in the hospital, you're not going to get the best medical treatment either. So the key really is to find a place where you're valued and respected, and life will be good.
All right. We have to pause again for this break. When we come back, I will have a preview of my guest for next week. Thus, we will conclude our conversation with Professor Frederick T. Golder. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Jacob Pyle Show. My guest for tonight is Professor Frederick T. Golder, author of Reaching Common Ground, which is published by Luminary Press and can be found on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and other places. I hope you can join us next week on the Jacob Pyle Show, where my guest will be author Lori Kay. When we last left off on our break, we're on this list right now of different issues, and I just want to remind our viewers again that the stuff we're mentioning here is, if you're just tuning in, the stuff we're mentioning here is not intended to be legal advice at all. It should not be considered as legal advice. So last break we talked about, or last segment we talked about employment issues. Now let's talk about business issues.
Okay. What would you like to talk about? It's pretty much the same thing. You have to listen to your employees. When you're dealing with business issues, you have to keep an open mind, and you have to realize that employees are human beings, and they react in a way that you have to treat them with respect. They're not just people that can be interchanged. They are all different. They're all unique. And you have to learn as a business, if you want to have a business that thrives, you want them to be valued and esteemed. They have other things that motivate them besides money, intrinsic motivation. They want to be valued. And that's one of the intrinsic motivations. And when people in business understand how to generate that, how to motivate people, they're going to be much more successful at it. And, Jacob, I did want to, in general, talk about these things that we can do when we're dealing with conflict. And it doesn't matter whether the conflict is an employment conflict, a business conflict, a relationship conflict, any type of conflict. These are traps to avoid that I want to share with your listening audience. And the three traps that I tell people to avoid. One is, I call it the intent impact trap. And that is, we oftentimes make assumptions when someone upsets us. We make assumptions that they intended to do that, when in fact they may not have had that. So the fact that it impacts badly on you doesn't mean that was their intent. So always avoid the intent impact. When someone says something, don't take it personally. Learn. The second is the judgment assumption trap. You make an assumption based upon limited information, and then you form a judgment for that assumption, and you just escalate your conflict. And finally, what I call the binary trap, which is either or. A lot of the conflicts are not either or conflicts. There are many different sides to it, and you have to consider all those sides. And I want to, when you're dealing with conflict of any kind, Jacob, these are the tools that I suggest and recommend to your listening audience. These are the tools to use. Open mind. Don't make judgments. Keep an open mind. Be curious. That's a second tool. Learn to be curious, not judgmental. Learn to be curious. And you can learn something when you're curious. And finally, empathy. You want to try to put yourself in the other person's shoes. So those tools you should use in any conflict that you have. So I'm finally going to leave this, and we can talk some more, but I'm going to give you these mindful reminders for your listening audience. Biases that we all have, and there's no one that doesn't have a bias. We all have them. Biases affect our opinions. Emotions impact our decisions. Every one of us, we're all different and unique. And we see things through our own filtering lens. The next, you cannot change anyone's opinions. And this, I think, is maybe one of the most important. You choose how to respond to somebody else. If someone is nasty, you don't have to respond in a nasty way. You can respond in a way that opens up communication channels to show that you're curious, to show that you're not judging, but you're really there to learn. You're involved in a learning conversation. And that pretty much sums up the book. I had an acronym for my book, which I call TREAT, conflict. These acronyms are very helpful sometimes. TREAT, conflict. The 5 letters of TREAT, conflict. So this is what you want to do in building and trying to resolve a conflict. Trust. An essential element to resolving any conflict requires building and maintaining trust. Respect. You got to respect each other's opinions. Doesn't mean you agree with them, but it does mean you're going to work to understand it, the other person's point of view, and you're going to respect it, not necessarily agree with it. And you're going to have empathy. You're going to recognize, understand, and share their thoughts and feelings. These are all essential to resolving the conflict. And finally, you're going to deal with that person in a neutral, non-judgment way, acknowledgement of the person. Everybody likes to be acknowledged. I acknowledge you, and they feel better about it. And finally, tolerance. A fair, objective, and permissive attitude to those whose opinions, practices, culture, gender, skin color, age, sexual orientation, personality, and other characteristics are different from your own. You grow up in a particular cultural environment and you think that is the best environment there is. Well, guess what? The other person has grown up in a cultural environment that may be different than yours, and he or she may think the same way you do, that my cultural environment is better than your cultural environment. But don't play that game. The game to play really is to understand. That's pretty much in a nutshell how it goes. Anyway, I appreciate the opportunity to share the information I learn with your listening audience, and I hope that they find this information helpful as they navigate through their conflicts that, as I said, they're inevitable. There isn't a day that goes by that you don't have one conflict. You sometimes have many conflicts, but to deal with them constructively requires mindfulness.
So we have about 2 minutes left in our conversation. What would be your advice to anybody who wants to be an attorney?
That's a good question. And this is really interesting. If you want to be a lawyer, generally speaking, you have to go to undergraduate school for 4 years, although I'm not sure why you do that. And then you either have to go to law school for 3 years. And let me say, it's work. It's hard work. But if you put the effort and energy into it, you can make it through law school. It's just a matter of working hard. Some people think, oh my God, law, you don't have to necessarily be the smartest kid in your room. You just have to be motivated to put in the effort to succeed in law school. It's just effort. It's effort and energy. It's willing to put in the time and effort and energy. There are law schools that people can go to that may not require you to have an LSAT. One of the schools I taught at, the Massachusetts School of Law in Andover, and I'm not necessarily telling people, but you don't need an LSAT score to go there. And if you graduate from that law school, which is a lot of hard work, you can sit for the Massachusetts bar. There are many schools all over the country that are not necessarily ABA accredited law schools, but they are accredited in their respective states, and you can get to have a law degree even if you don't go to one of the ABA accredited law school. So there's certainly ways to do it if you're interested.
All right. Well, as we always say around here, this conversation could go on forever if we wanted it to, but as far as the show is concerned, we have to end our conversation here as we're out of time. My guest has been Frederick T. Golder, author of Reaching Common Ground, which is published by Luminaire Press and can be found on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and other places. Thank you, Fred, so much for joining us. I'll be back next week with another guest to talk to. Until then, for Frederick T. Golder, Zach Brown, and all of us on the Jacob Pyle Show, I'm Jacob Pyle. Thank you all for watching, and good night, everybody.
If you want to be a guest on the Jacob Pyle Show, or if you'd like a DVD copy of tonight's program, send Jacob an email. His email address is jtpyle1@aol.com. Or if you're ordering a DVD copy of tonight's program, send $10 check or money order to the Jacob Pyle Show, care of Pyle Media Ventures. Post Office Box 154, Noblesville, Indiana 46061. Please include the air date seen on your screen when ordering. Residents outside of Indiana add $5 shipping and handling. This is Zach Brown speaking for the Jacob Pyle Show, a Pyle Media Ventures presentation. This program has been pre-recorded.